Margaret Winters had been sitting at the same desk in the Pentagon's East Corridor for 40 years. The 67-year-old woman would arrive at the same time every day, drink the same thermos of tea, and do her work in the same silence. Military documents, personnel files, logistics reports. Millions of pages had passed through her hands, but she had never made a comment. Some called her the ghost because you could barely feel her presence. No one knew what was behind her eyes, until Lieutenant James Parker defied General Thompson's direct order. When the meeting room door closed, no one expected Margaret to get up from her desk and go inside, and certainly no one could have predicted that the words from her mouth would change the balance of the entire Pentagon. Welcome to Best Honor Stories. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching this extraordinary story of courage and forgotten heroism from. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us preserve them. Washington, D.C., Pentagon, September 15th, at 5:17 a.m., Margaret Winters passed through the security checkpoint at the Pentagon's east entrance as usual. Security Officer Tom smiled at her as always, but as always received no response. Margaret just nodded slightly, showed her security card, and passed through the metal detectors. "Good morning, Miss Winters," said Tom out of habit. "Looks like it's going to be a nice day today." Margaret nodded again, with a slight smile. Tom thought he never heard more than 2 words from this woman. To be honest, most of the time he heard no sound at all. But this was a routine that had been repeated every morning for 12 years. Margaret proceeded toward the E-ring, where the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, was located. Her steps were calm and measured. The corridors were almost empty, with only a few cleaning staff and early arriving employees. Margaret headed directly to her desk without making eye contact with anyone. Her desk was just outside the office of DIA Director General Robert Thompson. She had been working in the same position in the same place for 40 years, administrative assistant. But everyone called her a secretary, which Margaret didn't mind at all. What mattered to her wasn't titles, but doing her job. She turned on her computer, prepared her thermos of tea, and began organizing the day's first files. This morning, she saw a meeting notification labeled urgent on her computer screen. A note about a high-level intelligence briefing at 9 a.m. in General Thompson's private meeting room. The participant list included senior DIA officials and Lieutenant James Parker. Margaret knew Parker. The young man had been assigned to the DIA 6 months ago. He was a 29-year-old, bright, idealistic intelligence officer. Like most newly assigned personnel, he had initially said good morning to Margaret and tried to tell her things. But after seeing Margaret's usual silent response, over time he too had begun to just nod in greeting. Around 8:30, the corridor began to bustle. Senior officers, civilian analysts, Pentagon personnel, Margaret knew everyone who passed by her. But most didn't even notice her. She was just the old secretary in front of the general's office. "Good morning, Miss Winters," said a voice. Margaret looked up. Lieutenant Parker was standing in front of her, in his formal uniform, holding a file. Margaret nodded in greeting. "I have a meeting with General Thompson. May I go in?" Margaret looked at the clock, then at the schedule on her screen. "He hasn't arrived yet," she said briefly. "He'll be in the meeting room at 9. Parker nodded, smiling slightly. "Thank you." Margaret watched him. The young man walked down the corridor and sat in a chair in the waiting area. He opened the file in his hand and began reviewing his notes. Margaret could see that he was tense. His hands were trembling slightly, and he kept looking up from the file to check the time. At 8:55, General Thompson arrived. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man of 50. With his sharp gaze and authoritative posture, he commanded everyone's attention when he entered a room. "Good morning, Margaret," he said as he passed by. Without waiting for an answer, he went into his office. The phone on Margaret's desk rang. "Direct Lieutenant Parker to the meeting room," said General Thompson's voice, "and I don't want any disturbances today." "Understood, sir," said Margaret, hanging up the phone. She turned to Parker and nodded. "The general is waiting for you, Lieutenant." Parker stood up, rearranged his file one more time, and took a deep breath. "Thank you, Miss Winters." Margaret watched the young man enter the meeting room. After the door closed, she returned to her usual work. But something was different. Margaret perked up her ears and began to listen. Normally, no sound would leak from the meeting room. The walls were thick, and the rooms were designed to be soundproof. But with years of experience, Margaret could hear certain things, and right now the voices rising from the room were different from a normal meeting. 15 minutes later, the voices escalated. Margaret could hear General Thompson's angry tone, and then a younger, more hesitant voice, Lieutenant Parker. Margaret got up from her desk. She did something she had never done in 40 years. She approached the meeting room door and listened. "This is a direct order, Lieutenant," General Thompson was shouting. "You will approve the dawn operation and prepare your report accordingly." "Sir, with all due respect, I cannot," said Parker's voice. "Our intelligence reports indicate the presence of civilians in that area. This operation could cost innocent lives." "Lieutenant, let me tell you something clearly. This is a war, and in war sometimes we have to make tough decisions. There's a high-level terrorist cell in that area, and we need to neutralize them. But, sir, a different approach." "Enough," General Thompson cut him off. "This is an order, Lieutenant. Either you comply or your career ends here." There was a long silence. Margaret moved even closer to the door. "I'm sorry, sir," Parker finally said, "but I cannot execute this order. It goes against both the military code of ethics and my personal values." Margaret heard General Thompson utter an angry curse, then heavy footsteps. Margaret quickly backed away, but she was still there when the door opened. General Thompson was surprised to see Margaret at the door. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" Margaret hesitated for a moment. It was time to break the silence she had maintained for 40 years. "I need to show you something, General," she said, her voice stronger and more determined than usual. General Thompson frowned. "This can wait, Margaret. Right now I have a very important—" "No, it can't wait," said Margaret, interrupting the general. Perhaps for the first time in Pentagon history, a secretary was directly contradicting a general. "This is directly related to what you're discussing right now." General Thompson's face filled with a mixture of surprise and anger, but the determination in Margaret's eyes gave him pause. "Come in," the general finally said, opening the door wider. Margaret entered the meeting room. Lieutenant Parker was standing on the other side of the table, his face pale and tense. "This is Ms. Winters, my secretary," said General Thompson to Parker. "Apparently she overheard our conversation and wants to be involved." Parker looked at Margaret in surprise. He saw her every day, but he had never seen her like this. Determined, confident, almost commanding. Margaret took an old yellowed envelope from her bag. "General Thompson, I want to show you something, a document, dated 1973, from an operation in Vietnam." General Thompson frowned. "Margaret, what does this have to do with our current situation?" "Everything," said Margaret. She opened the envelope and took out a photograph. In the photo, a young woman was standing with a group of men in military uniforms. The woman was too young to be recognized, but the expression in her eyes was the same, Margaret Winters' eyes. "This is me," said Margaret. 1973, Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam. My code name was Whisperer. I served in the Central Intelligence Agency's Special Operations Unit. The atmosphere in the room changed. General Thompson looked more closely at the photograph, then at Margaret's face. "You were a CIA agent?" Margaret nodded. "Not just an agent, General. I was the operations chief of a special unit. My team conducted intelligence gathering, sabotage, and rescue operations behind enemy lines." Parker held his breath in astonishment. But you're a secretary for 40 years. "Yes, Lieutenant. I've been a secretary for 40 years. But before that, I undertook missions for my country that you can't even imagine." Margaret pulled out another document. August 15th, Khe Sanh region. My team and I were assigned to an operation targeting a Viet Cong headquarters. Intelligence reports said there were no civilians in the area. General Thompson listened carefully. Margaret paused for a moment, her eyes drifting to the distance. "But the intelligence was wrong," she continued. "During the operation, we discovered there were women and children in the village. Our commander, Colonel Richard Hayes, ordered us to continue with the operation. Total war, he said. Sometimes innocents get hurt." Margaret looked at Parker. "Just as you're objecting now, I objected to that order. Civilian casualties were unacceptable, but Hayes wouldn't listen. "What happened?" asked Parker, his voice trembling slightly. "The operation went ahead, and it happened exactly as we feared. 93 civilians were killed, mostly women and children. Yes, we destroyed the target. Yes, we captured important intelligence, but I never forgot the cost." Margaret turned to General Thompson. "For the next 2 years, I had nightmares about that night. And then, when the war ended, I left the CIA. I started working as a simple secretary at the Pentagon, because I no longer wanted to risk anyone's life. But at the same time, I always wanted to keep an eye on the system." General Thompson sat down at the table. The expression on his face had changed from anger to surprise, then to deep thought. "For 40 years you've been sitting here, at my desk," he finally said, "and nobody knew who you were." "They didn't need to know," said Margaret. "I just wanted to do my job, and maybe one day prevent someone from making the same mistake you're about to make." Parker, still in shock, was looking at Margaret. "What about afterward? What happened after Vietnam?" Margaret smiled slightly. "Life went on, Lieutenant. I got married, had children, now I have grandchildren. But I never forgot the lesson I learned that night in that village. Sometimes, to do what's right, you have to disobey orders." General Thompson remained silent for a long time. Then he got up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the Pentagon courtyard was visible, the American flag waving in the wind. "Margaret," he finally said, his voice had changed, "do you think we should listen to Lieutenant Parker?" Margaret looked directly into the general's eyes. "I can't tell you what to think, General, but I can tell you this. I still hear the screams of those civilians in that village, and I wouldn't want you to have the same nightmares." A long silence fell over the room. General Thompson looked at Margaret, then at Parker. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Lieutenant Parker, I want to review your report again. Show me your evidence of civilian presence." Parker nodded with surprise and relief. "Yes, sir, right away." General Thompson turned to Margaret. "And you, Margaret, we have a lot to talk about." Margaret nodded. "Yes, General, I suppose we do." After that day, rumors began to spread about the old secretary and the Pentagon's E-ring corridor. No one knew exactly what had happened, but something had changed. General Thompson had begun treating Margaret with more respect, and even more surprisingly, Margaret was now talking. In light, measured sentences, but she was talking. She was saying good morning to people, occasionally asking questions, even sometimes smiling. The Pentagon staff was astonished. The woman known as the Ghost had suddenly become a living, real person. Lieutenant Parker began visiting Margaret's desk every day, sometimes just for a brief chat, sometimes for her advice. Margaret began telling the young officer about her days in Vietnam, her career in the CIA, and her subsequent silent years. Parker was more surprised each time. "Why didn't you tell us before?" he asked one day. "Why did you wait 40 years?" Margaret took a sip of her tea. "Because it wasn't the right time, Lieutenant, and maybe there wasn't the right person, until you came along." A month later, General Thompson called Margaret to his private office. "I have an offer for you," he said. "We're establishing a new unit for DIA intelligence ethics and standards, and I want you to head it." Margaret was surprised. "Me? But I'm just a secretary, General." Thompson smiled. "No, Margaret, you're much more than that, and I think we need your experience and wisdom now more than ever." Margaret considered the offer. "What about my desk? I've been sitting there for 40 years. "The desk will be waiting for you," said the general. "But perhaps now, instead of just processing documents that pass behind you, you could be the person who shapes them." Margaret nodded. "I'll think about it, General." 3 months later, there was a new nameplate in the Pentagon's E-ring corridor. Margaret Winters, Director of DIA Intelligence Ethics and Operational Standards. And even more surprisingly, Margaret's office door was always open. Young intelligence officers, analysts, even generals began coming to Margaret's office for consultation. Her experience in Vietnam, her career in the CIA, and her 40 years of observation at the Pentagon had given her a unique perspective. Lieutenant Parker was now working as Margaret's assistant. Together, they were developing a new guide that established ethical standards for intelligence operations. And at every step, the lesson Margaret had learned from that night in Khe Sanh guided them. Sometimes the greatest courage is to disobey orders. One evening, while Margaret and Parker were working late in the office, General Thompson appeared at the door. "I want to show you something," he said, holding a file. "The new operation plan. It's been revised according to your recommendations." Margaret took the file and quickly scanned it, an approach that prioritizes civilian safety. "Very good, General." Thompson smiled. "Let's say I'm paying a debt to an old friend." Margaret looked up. "An old friend?" "Yes," said the general. "I'm Colonel Richard Hayes's son." Margaret's eyes widened. "Hayes? But he was my commander in Vietnam." "I know," said Thompson. "My father was never the same after that operation. The civilian deaths affected him deeply. And with his dying breath, he told me something. Never ignore someone like Margaret Winters. She was right, I was wrong." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I never knew this. You didn't need to know," said Thompson. "But now perhaps you do need to know, because the impact of your courage reached further than you thought." That night, as Margaret Winters returned home, she felt truly at peace for the first time in 40 years. The breaking of her silence had not only saved that day's operation, but perhaps many lives in the future. And perhaps, she thought, the greatest courage sometimes lies not in firing a weapon, but in speaking the right word at the right time. 5 years later, Margaret Winters retired. A magnificent ceremony was held at the Pentagon. Hundreds gathered to honor her, from young intelligence officers to senior generals. During the ceremony, James Parker, now a captain, took the podium. "When I first saw Margaret Winters, I thought of her as just a secretary," he said. "How wrong I was. She taught all of us what it means to have courage, integrity, and to stand up for what you believe is right. And perhaps most importantly, she showed that sometimes the most valuable wisdom comes from the quietest sources." Margaret stood before the crowd and accepted the applause, but inside there was still a part of that old CIA agent, observing, listening, and when necessary, unafraid to speak the truth. At the end of the ceremony, a special medal was presented to Margaret, the Intelligence Community Medal of Merit. But for her, the most valuable reward was that after 40 years in the shadows, her voice was finally heard. Margaret Winters' story reminds us that courage has many faces. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not those who fight on the front lines, but those who quietly stand up for what is right. And sometimes the most important battles are won not on battlefields, but in meeting rooms, at desks, and even in a secretary's silent resistance. At Best Honor Stories, we believe that true heroes don't always wear uniforms, carry medals, or make headlines. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the people we pass by every day, whose names we don't even know. How many people like Margaret Winters are out there fighting their own silent battles, and how many are waiting for the right moment to make their voices heard? If this story touched you, please subscribe and share, and perhaps the next time you enter an office, look differently at the secretary sitting quietly at her desk. Who knows, maybe that person's story is a heroic epic waiting to be told. See you in the next story. And until then, remember, true courage is always found in the most unexpected places.